Hey everyone, Casella here. The ARB fundraiser goes live this week. Your support and helping spread the word about it would be greatly appreciated. We've got some really big things in the works, but we need your help to do it. Check out the link to that in the show notes, and that's all I got. Let's go on to this show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Bruckens. Each episode, we take one book and ask what's well or poorly done about it, try to get into what it's thinking and saying and arguing, and argue what it might be saying to or about the larger field of literature, especially speculative literature. Today, we are discussing David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, and I'm delighted to welcome Abigail Nussbaum back to the podcast. Abigail's writing on science fiction and culture appears in Locus, Vector, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Strange Horizons, and many more. She's a regular contributor to the politics blog Lawyers, Guns, and Money and maintains her own blog, Asking the Wrong Questions. She won the Hugo Award for Best Fan Writer in 2017 and again just last year. And some of her best reviews have been collected in book form in the excellent Track Changes. Abigail, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me back. And thank you for agreeing to discuss this book, which I really love.
Yeah, this was a fun pick. But before we dive into this, I wanted to ask what else you have been reading. Anything interesting?
Lots of interesting stuff. I think the one that really comes to mind, and there's going to be a review of it by me in Locus as we're recording this tomorrow, is The Misheard World. That's world, not word, because the title is a pun, by Olivia Waite. Whiteley is one of those writers who's well known in the science fiction and fantasy community in the UK. I don't know how much she's made the jump to the US. She absolutely should. She's one of the most interesting writers working today. And every one of her books is different. Every one of her books is very weird. Some of them are more science fiction. Some of them are more horror. And a theme that kind of comes around again and again in her books is storytelling. And in most science fiction and fantasy, when writers write about storytelling, it's like the magic of storytelling, the power and numinousness of storytelling. And in Whiteley's writing, it's like the danger of storytelling. And The Misheard World, which I am now mispronouncing again, is very much about that. It's about a world that's in the midst of a civil war. And the protagonist is a prison guard who has been asked to monitor the interrogations of an operative for the other side. And he starts telling his interrogator stories where she starts recognizing herself. And it's a whole work of manipulation between him and the interrogator and her. And I literally cannot say any more about it because there's a lot of twists and turns in this story that I can't reveal, but it is, for Whiteley, who is a top-notch author, is one of her top books. And I'm really hoping that it gets a lot of attention this year.
Oh, that's cool. That's great to hear. Yeah, also agree on the Whiteley being one of those authors who is weirdly siloed off from the American SF scene. Keep waiting for that to break through, but I feel like that wall's gotten, maybe I'm just more aware of it. I feel like that wall's gotten thicker or higher or something lately over the last couple of years or decades. I don't know.
There are authors who seem to struggle to traverse it. I don't know why specifically those authors. I mean, Whiteley, I think, would be kind of a writer's writer, a reviewer's writer, wherever she was writing. But the fact that, there are a lot of people who like weird and experimental fiction in the US who I think are a lot less aware of her, I don't know why that's happening, and it's definitely not only happening to her.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that a lot with Nina Allen, where it's just like, it's hard to find like US copies of it. Like I went to like order a couple of her books. I just straight up couldn't do it through my bookstore. Like I had to find other ways to get them. They're just not available here. Yeah, it's a strange thing. I have been reading a lot. I'm trying to think what, I'm just going to go with what I've read most recently, which is Alexis Hall's Hell's Heart, which is coming out here in a little bit. I'm reviewing it. I am real ornery about retellings. My notes in the margin are kind of like why on every single page. but it's a Moby Dick riff, but on Jupiter, like hunting like space whales. And it's really leaning into the kind of the specific mode of maybe like Gideon the Ninth, of kind of like really like pop culture reference drenched and sort of like extremely irreverent. But I think it does succeed in having some sort of like odd themes that sort of like do really well sort of under that cover of like constantly shouting like I'm not a serious book, but then it really has some other stuff going on in it. So it was fun. I don't know. I haven't written my review yet. I need to process my orneriness about the retelling a little more. But
Well, is it a romance? Because I know Hall mostly is a romance author.
it is horny, and there's multiple romantic stories in it. It's not a romance, I wouldn't
Oh,
say.
that's interesting because Tor has been trying to like rope in all of these authors who are best known for romance and romanticy, quite understandably. But you've also got I think it's Olivia Waite, right, who's
Hmm.
been writing this series of mysteries for them, and that's also like there's romance in there, but it's not specifically romantic fiction. So it's interesting that that's how they're approaching it.
Yeah, I could see this being twisted a little bit and going into more of like a science fiction romance direction, but it's definitely leaning more in the sort of like slightly gonzo Tamsin Weir sort of direction is clearly what they're kind of going for. So I don't know. I recommend it. I'll have more to say about it. Got to process my Moby Dick feelings. I think part of my beef with riffs is kind of like you're a fine writer. Why are you making me think of like what is acknowledged to be like one of the most legendary books in the English language? This was kind of like my grief with Metallic Realms by Lincoln Mitchell, which I think is really interesting. But I'm like, why are you inviting me to think about Nabokov on every single page? It's just, why would you do that?
Yeah, I mean, and that specifically, right? Like you're calling attention to the greatest classic of the English language, and you're trying to do the same thing. You need to be very secure in yourself, and there are writers who can do that. Hanya Yanagihara's riff on Pale Fire, it's the people in the trees, right? And that is just so good, and it's so cutting and very much her own thing. She's not trying to be Nabokov; she's recalling Nabokov. But you gotta be at that level if you're going to do that, and I think that that's kind of relevant to what we're about to discuss.
Yes, good bridge. Let's talk about a book that may be referencing a few different things. So today we're talking about Cloud Atlas, David Mitchell's third novel. It was originally published by Scepter in 2004. So if people aren't familiar with this, it's a nested book. So there's 6 storylines, and it's sort of like a Matryoshka doll. So each of the first 5 kind of like cut off, switch to the next one, and we have one in the middle, and then it goes back out the other way. It's a genre crossing novel. It was nominated for or won awards sort of on both sides of the divide. It was nominated for the Nebula. I believe it won the British Book Award. And it was adapted into a film in 2012. We'll probably talk more about Mitchell's sort of larger deal, but this is one of the first books of his writing where you can start to see that he's sort of constructing this larger, self-referential mega novel kind of thing. I had read this before. I enjoyed it, but it had odd feelings the first time I read it, and I hadn't really picked it up or thought about it in a long time. And then you suggested we read it. So tell me about your sort of like relationship with this book, why you wanted to come back to it. Yeah, what are your kind of like big thoughts on it?
Okay, so it is not an exaggeration to say this is the book that made me. Like not the book, there's like a 5, 10 books that are in that list, but it is on that list. And if you were ranking it, it would rank pretty high. Basically, I was in my early 20s. I was in university. I was enjoying many used bookstores in the vicinity of university campus. And I was kind of exploring my reading world. I was, sort of starting to realize I like literary fiction, I like historical fiction, I like science fiction, but not, the same kind of science fiction that I read as a teenager. And one of the ways that I explored that is I was going online and trying to find people to talk about this, to get recommendations from. I was looking up authors that I admired and getting recommendations from them. And I ended up on this forum called Readerville, which is, I think, a spin-off of a forum that Salon magazine started called The Well. And it's kind of like a precursor to blogs, and after that, social media. But it was basically just this very simple forum where people were talking about and recommending books. And at some point, someone recommended a novel called The Cloud Atlas. Not long after, I was in a bookstore and I saw a book. This book, in fact, you can see it. Remember when they still sold literary fiction in mass market paperback? A book called Cloud Atlas. And so I bought it. And it was only after I bought it and brought it home that I realized there had, in fact, been two books called Cloud Atlas that year. One of them was Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, and the other one was The Cloud Atlas by an author whose name currently escapes me. But it doesn't matter because I never read that book. I read this one.
Oh, that's too good.
No, it's wonderful. It's like the universe literally pushing this book in my direction. And the thing is, I absolutely would have ended up reading this book because everyone in my friend group became obsessed with it, and it was nominated for the Clark and the Nebula Award, as you said. There is no way I would have ended up not reading this book. But the fact that it came into my life so early and without any preconceptions, I have this very vivid memory of lying in bed in my dorm room, reading a bit before going to bed, and reading the first chapter, The Pacific Journal of Adam Ewing, and getting to the switch point. And like the other chapters, when they switch, they find a stopping point. It's the end of a letter. It's the end of a passage. This chapter very deliberately ends mid-sentence, and you turn the page and it's the beginning of the next chapter. It's very deliberately in your face from the top rope. And I'm sitting there thinking, what has happened? Did I buy a misprint? Is this a mistake? And like just the shock of it has lingered with me for 20 years. And of course, I continued reading. I love the rest of the book. But the fact that this memory remains so vivid for me, I think it speaks to how well done this book is.
No, that's good. I mean, I think you're right to call out to the intentionality of just that one being that way, to really just kick you right in the teeth and be like, hey, pay attention, something strange is going on here. Is really good. So I've read, I don't know how many of his books I've read. I've read quite a number of his books, and I mentioned this when we were emailing back and forth about picking this book, that I always feel like a little tetchy about him in some way, but then I read him and I'm like, man, he really knows what he's doing. Like both the prose on the page, which is in like a bunch of different styles. I will say some of them work better than others. I want to talk a little bit about particularly the most futuristic sections here. But he's so good at what he's doing on the sentence level, and then he's thinking so much, obviously, about the structural level. And I don't know, something I've just come to really prize more and more in reading is just fun. And he's having such a blast setting this stuff up for us. And I think, one of my kind of like, I don't even want to call it a complaint. One of my questions about this book, and maybe kind of Mitchell's, I don't want to talk too much about his like mega novel because I'm not like an expert on it. But one of my kind of questions about this book is it relies on meaning something, but I'm not sure what it is. It relies a lot on these sort of connections. It's not, because I wouldn't want to say that the control metaphor of the Cloud Atlas is like meaningless, right? Like, because a cloud atlas is, sort of a record of different types of clouds in the sky. But clouds are, ephemeral, right? They appear and they go away. They're not solid objects. And so this book is trying to do something about connections and patterns recurring, but I'm not totally sure what. So we'll circle around that. Jumping in this offhand, I'm wondering like how to kind of structure this conversation, ironically enough. I should have put some more thought into that. I've been thinking a lot on this read about the order that these are placed in and what is happening with that thematically. So obviously they're chronological in the sense that each of the six storylines first progresses in time and then goes back in time. So it has this like very neat, I think do they call that book leafing in carpentry, right? Where like the grain pattern is like split in half. So it like matches.
You have reached the edge of my knowledge of carpentry. So
there's some weird things with the structure of it. And specifically the thing, I guess I'll just jump to, that was kind of nagging at me a little bit this way is one of the things the novel is built around is this idea of like recurring lives, right? Or like some sort of connection, something like reincarnation, or something like maybe not that strong, but some sort of like recurring patterns of relationships people have, with this tattoo, or not tattoo, but birthmark that appears on people. And then there are other like odd little interesting recurring motifs that show up a lot. But there's this weird thing in it. I don't want to do too much of it. I feel like I may be doing too much of like a nerdy science fiction, what is reality kind of read on this. But there's this odd sort of like inner reality disjunct that I'm not sure the text is 100% aware of, which is that the third story, the mystery, the Half-Lives, the first Louisa Ray mystery, is presented in the next one as a fictional book. But it contains the previous two presumably non-fictional stories. I'm not sure what to make of that. Partially it's just fun, and I don't want to be one of those like, construct a David Mitchell wiki style readers, like tracking everything like it's Star Wars canon or something like that. But it's really odd. I don't know. Did that jump out to you? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It absolutely did jump out at me. But you know what? Before we get into that, because I absolutely have some thoughts about that, why don't you let me give you my hopefully not terribly long unified theory of Cloud Atlas?
Please.
And
yes.
Because my thoughts on that whole game of fictionality and reality are very much related to that. So Cloud Atlas is published 2003, 2004. I'm actually not quite sure which one is which. I think maybe it has different publication dates in the UK and the US. And I think if you're looking back, even if you lived through that period, certainly if you're a bit younger and you weren't a reader at the time, it is hard, I think, to understand how high the walls between genres were and how much resistance there was to crossing them. And you've got, for example, someone like Jonathan Lethem, who in the 90s is a science fiction writer, and he writes Girl in Landscape, which is a coming of age story about a girl whose mother dies and whose father kind of checks out, and she sort of has to become the head of the family. And it takes place on an alien planet, and there are aliens there. And Lethem talks about his publishers and his agents telling him, we have no idea how to sell this book. And he keeps going with science fiction a little, and finally he gives up and he writes Motherless Brooklyn, which makes him a huge star. And he really never looks back. He doesn't write science fiction again. And around the same time, you have Kate Atkinson, a literary fiction writer, just plain in the middle of litfic, and she publishes Case Histories, which is a detective novel, but it's got all these literary flourishes. Mainly, there is no single case. The detective is bouncing around between different cases, and his own life and problems and family history are also a major issue in all of his casework. And this blows people's minds. How is this possible? How can we do this? Is this permitted? And at the same time that this is happening, you also have literary fiction writers who are very concerned about this siloing. You had an episode on The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova a couple of months back, and that's a terrible book. I agree with both of you that it's a terrible book. But it was written in part because of this anxiety over, we have perfected literary fiction. We know how to write these complex and human characters. We know how to write these gorgeous sentences, and audiences are bored. And we have to go back to the 19th century and write novels that are literary, but also that have plot and excitement. And we have to bring the readers back. So Kostova does not manage this, but Michael Chabon, who is a standard bearer for this entire movement, he writes The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which is very much in its structure and style and approach a literary novel. And it's about complex characters and complex relationships, but it's also about something very pop culture. It's about comics. It's got all these exciting events. There's war and death and relationships that break down in secret paternity. And that really works for him. And he writes the Yiddish Policemen's Union roughly around the same lines. And all the time he's doing that, he's coming out with op-eds and with anthologies saying, we cannot let the genre writers control this entire field. We cannot let them be the only ones who are having fun, because audiences want to have fun. Meanwhile, while all of this is happening within genre, you've got an entirely different set of anxieties, because the new wave has come and gone. Cyberpunk is sort of winding down, and no one really knows what the next big thing is going to be. There's an attempt at what's called mundane SF, which I think in these days has sort of transitioned over to climate fiction, but it doesn't really take off. And what we get instead is the new weird. And the new weird is a lot of things, but one of the things that it is authors saying, we do not accept the division between science fiction and fantasy. We're going to write fantasy like it's science fiction. We're going to write science fiction like it's fantasy. And if you look at Perdido Street Station by China Miéville, which is in many ways the defining work of the new weird, its main character is a scientist who is studying magic as if it were science. And it's telling you right from the start, this is how we're going to do things. So once again, we are breaking down walls. And along comes Cloud Atlas. And Cloud Atlas is that precisely. It is the breaking down of walls. It's saying, I'm going to be literary, and I'm going to be historical fiction, and I'm going to be detective fiction, and I'm going to be comedy, and I'm going to be two different kinds of science fiction. And they're all going to mash up together. And in between them, there are going to be all of these exciting connections. There's a comet birthmark that appears on some of these characters. There's a character in 1931 who dreams about the life of a cloned slave server who works in a futuristic Korean McDonald's in like the 21st century. There's characters who are telling themselves, I remember this, I'm listening to the music that a writer wrote 100 years ago and saying, I recognize this music. I know this music. It's not that I'm hearing it for the first time and it's touching me. I know it. And as you say, all of these connections are a bit weird. They're a bit askew. And there's this mixture of fictionality and of reality where, everything here is fictional, of course, but it's all mixed together. In other words, it is relying on your sense of recognition. It is relying on your ability to tease out these connections, but it's never giving you a full answer. So that's what was going on when Cloud Atlas was published in the early 2000s. And you flash forward 20-something years to where we are right now, and everything that was going on has been masticated. It has been consumed and made commercial. So you had these literary writers feeling very anxious about whether they can write, plotty fiction and how they can get audiences to pay attention to them. Well, I give you the publishing category of the new adult, where, by the way, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay is often sold. But you've also got other writers. You've got Taylor Jenkins Reid. You've got Lessons in Chemistry and Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. And these are all books that have that literary weight and have like interesting historical or like industry specific settings. But they're also very approachable to people who came up through YA. And you've got this whole notion of we don't have to divide science fiction and fantasy so strongly. And that has led us to a point where if you're writing a fantasy novel, the first question everyone's asking you is, well, what's the magic system? Mm-hmm. What is Aragorn's tax policy? Can't write a fantasy novel without knowing the hero's tax policy. Come on. And meanwhile, you've got this sense of connection that Cloud Atlas gives you, this excitement of spotting this connection. And I give you the MCU.
Right.
I give you this whole notion of the metatext, of the interconnection between works, between books and science and television and movies and comics. So this has all been processed. It has all been, they have figured out how to sell this. But if you go back to Cloud Atlas, and I think that this is kind of part of the reason that I was a bit concerned going back to it, because I was, I was aware of all this when I went back. And I said, is it going to feel kind of tired? Is all this commercialization going to project backwards? And I don't think it does. I think when you read this book, you get this freshness. it is not trying to rope you into the meta text. And this whole situation where you don't really know what's real and what's fictional, even within the reality of the book, I think that that is entirely deliberate. I think that Mitchell does not want to give you a concrete answer. I think he wants you to be disoriented about it. And there's more to say about that, but I have spoken enough. So
No, that's really good. I want to respond to like 19 different parts of that, but I'll narrow it down. First up, I think it's really great to point out that those genre anxieties were existing in different parts of the literary field, not just one. I'm reading Jeremy Rosen's genre bending right now, which I'm kind of it's good. I'm kind of gnashing my teeth out a little bit because it sort of has to make a bunch of assumptions in order to work. I think the biggest one just being that he needed a term to rally around, so he picks genre bending because that's like a thing that appears in blurbs a lot, right? Like, this, you could say that of Cloud Atlas, right? It's a genre bending masterpiece or something. But he doesn't really explain how the genres are bent. Like, what is the bending that is happening? And that just gets to me. And it has to make a lot of assumptions, because I don't think we have a good framework for this, about what quote-unquote non-genre literature is and what literary fiction is. What is the thing that Mitchell and Chabom and Lethem and all these other people are like departing from slightly to do these experiments? That's a bigger topic maybe than we can get into right now. But there's definitely, you're right, there's been this shift towards this commercialization or this accessibility sort of line to it. I want to come back to Mitchell's sort of awareness of what's going on in the book. I was thinking a lot about the condition of narration in this and sort of how we get it. One of the things that I think makes it feel fresh, and I don't want to say it dates it, but I feel like it sets it apart from the kind of thing being written today, is that it isn't wrapped up and delivered to you. It's not explained how you, the reader, are getting this thing. And it has this sort of odd, even though it's nested and it contains itself, because of the chronological structure of it, the sort of, how to say this, narratologically, the outside is the inside, right? Like the last story, in theory, contains the previous 5 in this like chain of connections. But that also means that the outside story, the Pacific Journal of Adam Ewing, doesn't contain all the rest, but that's the one you're actually getting. And it's not clear how you're getting it. So I was thinking a lot about how some of the books or some of the sections flag how you're getting it. Somni's story, the Orasan of the clone in the far future Korea, is like an audio video like hologram recording that is in the next one, right? And Somni got to see the Ghastly Ordeal, like the film version of it, right? So it has like this way that they're all transmitted sort of between levels, except that outside one then sits in this sort of strange place. And the very inside, or outside, kind of depending on how you're framing it, right? Sluicious Crossing, in a way, kind of sits on its own in a strange way. Parts of that bug me in terms of like how I, the reader, am getting it. But I think it also, I don't know, it makes me sort of pull back and think about that condition more. Like for one example, Somni's story uses this kind of like futuristic spelling and language evolution, right? Where like brand names have become lowercase common nouns, Nikes and Kodaks and Sonys are just, like regular nouns. And I don't think it uses GH or PH and a couple other constructions all throughout. Whenever it says X in something, it's just the letter X, right? So it has all of these things to sort of make you as a reader be like, oh, this is futuristic in a way that like, you're going to think of Clockwork Orange. You're going to think of maybe Ridley Walker, other people who have like experimented with ways of presenting future language. But we aren't getting Somni's written account. Like, right? Like in the world of Cloud Atlas, the people who get it as like an oral recording in Korean that they don't understand. So why are we, the readers, getting this sort of like textual experimentation on the page? And I'm not saying that's a mistake of the book, but it sets up this weird kind of like dissonance for me that I have to kind of like back away and think about it.
Well, I would say that Mitchell kind of anticipates that, because the matter of fictionality and of artificiality, it exists throughout the book. Robert Frobisher finds Adam Ewing's diary, or rather, he finds half of Adam Ewing's diary, because the conceit is that every one of these protagonists finds the first half that we have read. And then at the end of their story, on the other half, on the other side of Slush's Crossing, they somehow find the other half, which is kind of contrived, but I'm willing to go with it. But Robert Frobisher finds the first half of Adam Ewing's diary, and he writes, and I've written this down because it felt kind of significant, something shifty about the journal's authenticity seems too structured for a genuine diary, and its language doesn't ring quite true. So, like, this is Mitchell telling us straight out, don't believe me.
Uh-huh.
And I think that relates to the whole question of fictionality, because, for example, you've got Sonmi, and she's telling her story, her very exciting story of being a slave, a genetically engineered slave who works in a fast food store. And somehow she is her food, which is called soap, which is, as you said, that's a reference to Brave New World. Her food is doctored, and she's given food that allows her to develop her brain, to develop her language and cognitive abilities. And she ends up leaving the restaurant, and she lives in a university for a while, which, by the way, did you think of the Practice, the Horizon and the Chain when you reread that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I said, wait a minute.
I hadn't thought of that when reading the Scimitar, but now I was like, oh, wow, this is...
Of course not, because it's 20 years ago. But when I read it now, I was like, wow. But anyway, so she leaves, she goes to live in a university where she's kind of a trained monkey. And then she's kidnapped from there by a rebel group that, is trying to fight back against the corporocracy that rules their entire society. And she travels through this society, and she sees all the terrible things in it, and how people who are lower on the social ladder are treated, and how clones like her are treated. And of course, they live their lives being promised that after they serve 12 years, they will get to retire to Hawaii. And guess what? They do not retire to Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And she writes this manifesto that will be spread throughout their society so that they can topple the corporocracy. And then she's captured, and all of her allies are killed, and she's about to be executed herself. And the thing about Sonmi is that she is, in many ways, our most reliable narrator. Everyone else, even when we're not being alerted to the fictionality of their story, when it's not, Louisa Ray, she's in a conspiracy thriller, and her story is written like a conspiracy thriller. And even before Timothy Cavendish, the literary agent, receives that manuscript in the mail and reads it and starts commenting on all the problems with it, even before that, we're aware that this is kind of made up and unreal. But even the characters who are soundposted as real, even they are not really aware of their situation. Adam Ewing, for example, he's the victim of an affinity fraud, basically. Mm-hmm. Like, he's racist, and he does not trust people of color, and he trusts white people. And there's a white person in his vicinity who clocks that and says, okay, I can murder this guy for his money. He'll just do whatever I tell him to because I'm white. And that very nearly works. And Robert Frobisher is completely deluded. He lies to himself about many different things, including that several different women are in love with him, that he's in love with them, despite the fact that he's gay, that his employer is not aware that he is sleeping with his wife. I mean, this man does not know what's going on with him, and to the extent that he ends up seriously mentally ill. So Sonmi, even leaving aside that she is the most abject character in the novel, and that she's about to be executed, so her motivation for lying is very limited, she is signposted throughout her story as the most honest person in it, the person who understands herself and understands her society, and who is able to point out to her interviewer all of the lies that his society tells him and that he has been telling himself. So we get that for like 100 pages. And then right at the end, Sonmi says, but you get that this is all an act, right? Mm-hmm. Not even an act. You get that this was all a Disney.
Yeah, that's right.
And that right there, I think, is the reason for all of those neologisms, the Nike for shoe, Ford for car. I think that is precisely just for that, so that you can say this tale of rebellion and of this one brave, abject person rising up and speaking her mind, it's a Disney. So like even Sanmi, we're being told in the novel is not real. But I think that there's another scene in the novel that kind of tells you how to think about that. There's a scene in the second Louisa Ray chapter where Isaac Sachs, the scientist that she sort of had a flirtation with, and he is about to be murdered, so they will never be together. It's very sad. And he is writing this sort of philosophical meditation / diary entry to himself that in a real thriller would never exist.
Uh-huh.
And what he writes is there is no such thing as history. Even when we think we have all the dry facts and the eyewitness accounts, all we have is the story that they've told us. Every bit of history is a story. So I think that is what the novel is going for here. Like, yes, Adam Ewing is real and Louisa Ray is a fictional character, but they're both ultimately a story.
Sachs' little bit there, it's so like, he's a nuclear scientist, right? But he's just decided to like write down some Baudrillard, right?
Yeah.
But it is really interesting in this idea that, what does he say? Like there are actual and virtual futures, just as there are actual and virtual pasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was reading that this time around. I was thinking of a line of, I think it's Gibson's actually. I feel like I wind up quoting Gibson on here a lot, but that, we have to predict the past as much as we predict the future, and it actually gets harder. That there's a way that like as we get more technology and more knowledge about society, it becomes harder to remember a time before that. And so it actually takes more of an active imagination to create the past in some ways. But yeah, that bit there that Sachs has, and I think it's Cavendish says about the Louisa Ray mysteries. I wrote it down here. He says, yes, a contrived puzzle, but all thrillers would wither without contrivance.
Mm-hmm.
So it is constantly signposting that for us.
And like Cavendish also, at some point, I forget if he's talking about Louisa Ray or about his own book that he's going to write about his experiences. And he says, I can imagine the critics saying it's all been done before. And so what? A book is not about the what, it's about the how.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is also very clearly Mitchell saying to you, ignore the fact that I am mashing together 4 different dystopian science fiction novels in the Sanmi chapter and look at what I'm doing with that.
Cavendish's chapter is also the one where he says, what's a reviewer? One who reads quickly, arrogantly, but never wisely. So like Mitchell is aware that people are going to be reading this.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about the Cavendish chapter, but like I have to say that this time around, I read it and I said, well, no wonder they didn't give him the Booker after the way he depicts the Booker. Like there's literally a scene at the awarding of the Booker Award, and it does not go well.
Something that was really striking me about that I hadn't remembered it was the tonal variation in these. Like, I think that's part of what makes it work so well, because if it were just this kind of like, oh, everything is sad and depressing, but at least we're connected somehow. Like, you know what I mean? That would be one way to approach this. But these have such wildly different feels to each one, right? Like, the Louisa Ray mysteries, like, it's not like the tautest mystery ever, but it's really like, let's get some gunfights in there. Let's get some twists. Let's get some turns. I totally forgot how funny the Cavendish section is. Even though like the overall, ordeal is actually kind of spooky and kind of sad, right? Like being trapped in a home for the elderly and being abused by your nurses, not able to get away. That's not funny. But the story is so good and so funny and so like, I don't know, it has so much slapstick in it, and it has to have such a witty narrator who's not really aware of his own shortcomings and fumblings in this way that works really well. And then I think if, I was thinking a lot about this, about like the order that they're in and how they work. The Sanmi chapter or chapters are so interesting because they're really bleak. They are mashing together 4 different dystopias, but they have this odd purpose to them. And they're not, because of her voice, they're not really like reveling in the dystopia of it, if that makes sense. She's a really odd voice. She's very driven. I don't want to say she's like a blank character, but she doesn't really respond emotionally to much that's going on, but she has a strong sense of like purpose right from when right from when her narrative starts. I'm not sure what to say about that, but it colors the tone of how that works for me. It just moving between those and knowing that they're both going to be different thematics, but also different, I don't know, sort of different atmospheres to each section makes it work better as one thing, as opposed to if it had it's like a more sort of flat level tone.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me when I reread this book, and again, I came back to it a bit concerned that it wouldn't hold up because so much of what it has done has been done by so many other writers. And one of the things that really got me very quickly is just how well done it is. Like it gets the voice in each chapter so well. And yeah, sure, Sami and Sluicia's Crossing are both pastiches of things that were already very stylized and almost cliche years before Mitchell wrote this novel 20 years ago. But they're so well done and they flow so well. Like Sluicia's Crossing should not work. Sluicia's Crossing has got all this Ridley Walker phonetic spelling stuff and dropping all the G's. And like it should be unreadable and it should be so annoying, and it's not. It really works. It's really fun, even though, as you say, what actually happens in the chapter is pretty bleak. But it's interesting to follow these characters. It's interesting to hear their stories, and the way that you learn how to read their language, it's very natural. It happens very quickly, and you can hear Zachary's voice in your head. And there are so many writers who have tried to do this before Mitchell and after him, and they often fall flat. And just the basic reason is that he's good. He's really good.
It's a funny thing. I have really mixed feelings about the phonetic approach in Sluicia's Crossing. I agree that it works. I think it's a strange technique because I think mostly just because it has so much cultural baggage for me. Like when I see language written that way, that is used typically in a heavily classist, often racist way, because the convention generally is that we don't record language phonetically, right? Like we write dialogue as it's written, we write dialogue as it's written rather than as it's said aloud. You can write down almost anyone talking in a phonetic way, in a way that would look silly and strange, right? Because most of us drop a lot of our G's, and most of us don't say of, we say we just get a quick sound in there. And if you write it down that way, it looks strange. But it does work. I think it's something about how much he pays attention to. He's not trying to do like a pastiche of that style of writing. He's trying to like actually capture what this would sound like as a verbal tale and really paying attention to that.
Yeah, and it's like it's the language of this particular society, and they have their gods and they have their traditions. They have the iconry where they keep the icons of their dead relatives. They have old Georgie, their devil figure. He's given some thought to how the society functions, and I think that comes through in the language as well.
I will say on like the thorny, to get to like the title of the podcast, I think a thorny thing about this book is it's really concerned about race. It's like a central issue. And like spoiler, it ends with our main character like going off to join the abolitionists and presumably fight in the Civil War, right? On the good side. So like that's kind of like how Ewing is redeemed. Mitchell is doing a lot in here with trying to combat a sort of like Nietzschean will to power and the idea that might makes right. It has a lot of like setting up what is evil is greed in the corporations. What is evil is this sort of like hierarchical kind of like great chain of being kind of approach to how things work, right? So it's setting itself up to do this sort of like anti-hierarchical, anti-racist kind of work. I'm not sure how well all of it lands because of the specifics of how he's doing it. I'm specifically thinking about in Sluicia's Crossing, where for some reason it just recreates white people being persecuted by cannibal colored people in this way that just it's a weird choice. And then backed up with the fact that the prescients, this sort of like society of people who have held on to more science, that they are dark-skinned, but the book goes out of its way to point out they're not descended from dark-skinned people. They genetically engineered themselves for like UV protection. And then Merinim has that whole, so Merinim is this sort of like scientist, anthropologist from the society. she tells Zachary, our main character, this little speech that Zachary recounts to us about civilization and savagery, and that the difference between civilized and savaged is thinking about the future. And like, it's basically like the marshmallow test writ large. Now, I'm not saying Mitchell is saying this, and it's like, it's the son of our narrator of one of the stories recounting the way he remembers someone saying something else. But Marinim's speech sounds on the surface like this, like, oh, like, it's not about race. It's about like these deep instincts and how we like pause and think about time. And that is like a textbook white supremacy idea, that like what separates races is our relationship to time, and our ability to like control our urges and think about the future in this way that is like wildly racist, in a way that like Marinim and Zachary I don't think get. They're not realizing that they're replicating that. It's very weird. Because race crops up so much in every single one of these stories, it's really a central concern. Like, as you said, from Ewing, that being his sort of like Achilles heel, and then his sort of redemption at the end coming to that. I don't know, it runs through much of the book, and I'm not totally sure what to make of how it handles it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think when I read this book the first time, it's not that I didn't notice this stuff, but I was certainly a lot less aware of it, a lot less knowledgeable about it. So coming back to it this time, I definitely noticed it a lot more. But about the mirror images between the Ewing and Zachary chapters, I think that there's something interesting going on there. And I agree with you that I'm not sure it 100% works. Because when Adam Ewing starts writing his diary, he's on the Chatham Islands off New Zealand. And the history of the Chatham Islands is that there was a people living there called the Moriori. And at some point they were colonized and very nearly exterminated by the Māori, the inhabitants of New Zealand, with the connivance of British colonizers, but it was mostly the Maori's doing. And that's the history that Adam Ewing tells us. Kind of weirdly, he writes about the Moriori as being extinct, which is not true. There aren't a lot of them left, but there are still Moriori alive today. So again, weird that David Mitchell wrote about it that way, but that is the story that Adam Ewing tells us. And then we get to Sluicia's Crossing, and you've got Zachary's people, the Valley people, who they worship Sanmi. And like the Moriori, they practice extreme nonviolence. They believe that to take a life is to damn themselves, and it means that they will not be able to reincarnate within their own society. There are other tribes on this island, specifically the Kona, who practice enslavement and genocide. And then you've got Marinim's people, the Prescients, who have all this advanced technology. So there is a very obvious mirror image going on here to the situation on the Chatham Islands. When Zachary first meets Marinim, he is very suspicious of her. And when I first read the book, I wasn't that sympathetic to his suspicion. But reading it the second time around and realizing that Marinim and her people stand in for the European explorers and colonizers, that's actually a very reasonable concern. And it turns out to be mistaken, but still, entirely reasonable to look at these people who are massively technologically superior to you and who are collecting information about you and say, well, what's that in pursuit of? What are you going to do with all that information? And in the end, both Zachary's people and Marinim's people are largely exterminated. They end up escaping. They join another community on another island. This whole thing takes place in Hawaii. So Hawaii is made up of multiple islands. And what they're able to preserve is a little bit of their history. Marinim has the orison that Sanmi recorded her story on, but no one can understand that language. So there is, in fact, an extinction here that is more significant than what has happened to the Moriori in the real world. And, I'm saying all this because you read the book and you see all these parallels. And you see, for example, Adam Ewing, who, for all that he is a kind man who tries to help the escaped slave Atua, and that ends up saving his life, he still kind of buys into the ladder of civilization. Mm-hmm. He doesn't like it when his friend, who ends up being his poisoner, tells him, well, the world is just run by the strong and, the weak are devoured by them. He's says there must be a better way. And as you said, he ends up dedicating his life to abolition. But for all that, he still buys into this ladder of civilization. There are the civilized people and the uncivilized people, and Atua, for all that he's a good person, is a savage. So then we've got Marinum saying, no, it's not actually like that. There are good people and bad people in every civilization. So I think that is meant to be a better version of the same idea. But I agree with you that it doesn't work. I don't think that it sums up the novel. I think there's other things going on here. And I think that how Adam Ewing's story changes and ends in particular is perhaps more significant. But I agree with you that I read that scene between Zachary and Marinum, and it felt contrived. It felt like you guys are trying to come up with some scheme that divides good people from bad people. And I promise you that these people who are murdering and enslaving your people, they also think about the future.
Mm-hmm. And again, like, I'm not saying that, quote unquote, Mitchell is doing this, right? It's like characters doing this, but that are doing this dismissal of what's clearly a more sophisticated culture just because they happen to be winning right now. Against us in a way that really clearly mirrors how British and other European colonizers, thought of the Maori, right? I don't know. It's odd. The book wants to say something really concrete about race, but it can only think of it as sort of like trying to go like past race, in this way that like doesn't really work. I'm not sure what to say about that, but it's definitely something I was sort of gnawing on a lot throughout it.
Well, there is an element of the book that is past race, because some of the axes of oppression in this book are specifically past race. Sonmi looks just as Korean as all the people around her, but she's considered inhuman because of the fact that she was genetically engineered. And it is implied that some of her genetic engineering makes her biologically different to humans. She and the man she ends up traveling with, Heiju, they become lovers at some point. And while this is glossed over, it's implied that they have to sort of work around some basic physical limitations there.
This is a total side plot thing from that, but it is fascinating to me that the Sonmi chapter, the jump in like the implied world history between that and Slusha feels so big. I'm not sure what to put in there that somehow we got from Somni's world to Slusha's world. And specifically that Somni is a name known to Zachary and other people in his culture, right? Like it just, to me, it's one of those really interesting bit, and I hate to throw this word, but it's this really interesting bit of world building, right? That it throws in without explaining these centuries or even millennia of like revolution that have happened, and somehow Somni's what are they, her declarations, like they did have an impact, and that has come down somehow. I like that thread in there implied.
So there is I would say maybe the clearest connection between different chapters that does not run through the documents, because at some point Sonmi, either she's told or she tells her interviewer, she tells him, your society is collapsing. You've got people in the top who are consuming the people at the bottom. Uh-huh. The base of the pyramid is crumbling. You're not going to survive. And then at some point, Marinum says the exact same thing to Zachary. Mm-hmm. She says, this is what happened. The base of the pyramid collapsed. So the two chapters are telling you this is before the fall. This is after the fall. They are both observing the same event. And you're right. We don't understand how, despite that fall, Sonmi's declaration survived, and the concept of Sonmi survived, and then became adopted as a deity, as a bodhisattva, basically. Mm-hmm. So we don't know that part. But this is like, if this were like a traditional multi-threaded novel, past, present, and future, this is the connection between one level of the future and another farther future that doesn't really exist in other parts of the novel.
Let's take a quick break. I want to grab a quick drink of water, and I want to come back and zoom out again and think about what's going on in the field now that reflects this book's approach. I think there's actually a lot to say about that. We'll have to be quick about it. still talking about Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Abigail, what was the thing you just discovered in your notes that you want to talk about?
This is actually, it's something that you touched on a couple of times, and I kept wanting to mention it, and then other things got in the way because there's a lot to say about this book. But one of the things that really occurred to me is this book has two endings. There's the chronological ending, and then there's the ending on the page. And the chronological ending is Sluicious Crossing, and the ending on the page is Adam Ewing. And Sluicious Crossing is, I mean, I wouldn't call it a downer ending, but it's basically telling us this wheel of suffering and exploitation has not been broken. It's going to keep happening, and people will survive it. People will escape it. People will build good lives, and maybe for a time they will manage to build good societies, but it's just going to keep happening. And then Adam Ewing tells us this is a matter of choice. We can choose the world that we can live in. In fact, let's see if I can read this part. History admits no rules, only outcomes. What precipitates outcomes? Vicious acts and virtual acts. What precipitates acts? Belief. Belief is both prize and battlefield, within the mind and in the mind's mirror, the world. If we believe humanity is a ladder of tribes, a coliseum of confrontation, exploitation, and bestiality, such a humanity is surely brought into being, and history's Horrocks, Boerhaavs, and Gooses shall prevail. These are the bad people that he has met in his journey. You and I, the moneyed, the privileged, the fortunate, shall not fare so badly in this world, provided our luck holds. And then he talks about, how we can survive for a time, but eventually the base of the pyramid will collapse and we will also become consumed by it. And what we have to do is make a choice to try to build a better world. And that's when he commits himself to abolition. So on one level, the book ends on a very hopeful note. Adam's saying that I know that I can only do a very small part. I know that even abolition in itself is only a very small part of the evils that exist in this world, but I'm going to do my part. And the last line of the novel is, yes, it's one drop, but many drops make an ocean. But at the same time, because we know that this is the chapter that's earliest in history, because we know what has happened both in our world and in the world of the novel, we know that this did not work. So there is this tension between hopefulness and despair in the end of the novel that I think to me feels perhaps more important than what it's trying to say about civilization and savagery. And that tension is a realistic tension and a true tension. The world is what we make of it, and we are increasingly making of it not a very good place. That's as true today as it was 20 years ago. I really like the way that ending works. I like the way that it's giving you two different endings and telling you both of those endings are true. I think that works really well.
And it's doing, a little bit of interesting kind of ethics work there, right? In both sort of like putting forward this consequentialist argument, right? That the only thing that matters is what happens, but then also saying the important thing is to make a choice, right? And like saying like doing the right thing regardless of outcome is important. Even if Ewing's actions don't prevent the genocide in Sluicious Crossing, the enslavement of Zachary's people, that doesn't mean like he's making the wrong decision.
And I think it's also significant that the two endings are the distant past and the distant future, whereas the character who's contemporary to the novel, Timothy Cavendish, he's right in the middle. And I think that in some ways he's the least involved in everything that's going on around him. He's the least interested in his world. I find his chapter a lot less funny than you did. But one of the things that's interesting about it to me is that it feels like a very deliberate strike against literary fiction. And like everything else is a specific genre. And this is a specific type of literary novel that was being written in the 80s and 90s and a little bit in the 2000s. It's a bit old fashioned for 2003. But, this character who is the product of empire and is now living in a post-empire world. And he doesn't like to be thought of as a racist because racists are lower class. And there's multiple points in the story where he spots young white men, some of them with shaved heads, and he said, well, that person's a skinhead, that person's a Nazi, which, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's a little unclear. But nevertheless, he gets really annoyed when a black ticket seller in the train station tells him that he's stepped out of line and he has to go back. And he gets really, really pissed off when the nurse in his nursing home is kind of genderqueer.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you are not the solution here, friend. Like, you think of yourself as above this, but you are very much a part of this. And I think it's maybe the most cynical aspect of the novel, and maybe the reason that this chapter does not work terribly well for me, because this is a very earnest novel, and this chapter is extremely cynical.
Oh, interesting. It's interesting too, because I was thinking about that chapter, and specifically those parts of Mitchell doing a really good job of making a first-person narrator out themselves without being aware of it themselves. Right, that you, the reader, can figure out what Timothy Cavendish is like, but Timothy Cavendish doesn't know. But you're right, it is even as bleak as Sonmi's chapter is, right, with like people getting Soylent Greened and like the environment falling apart and like horrific, Hunger Games dystopia kind of thing. She is very earnest, and the voice is very like, here is the mission, here's what it's going to be. The Cavendish chapter, if it came out today, I would say it was irony pilled, right? Like
this guy, if he were alive today, he'd be voting for reform. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. We could keep talking about this book so long, but I want to zoom out a little bit. I really liked how you opened us up talking about sort of like how this book hit at the time, and this sort of like feeling of, I don't even know what to call it, fractures and fissions, weaknesses and weird divides sort of across the literary world that this book kind of reaches across in interesting ways. I don't want to make like a strong case for this book being influential in like a concrete way or something, and say like, you don't get this book without this book or something. But this feels like an important book that came at sort of a turning point. I think, didn't Charlie Jane Anders have a piece not that long ago about Cloud Atlas being really important to like this genre of speculative writers, people who've grown up seeing the sort of possibilities of this?
I think it's very much like it's the Velvet Underground joke. Well, the first part of the Velvet Underground joke about this book isn't true because everyone read it. Uh-huh. But I think a lot of people who read it then went out and wrote a book. Mm-hmm. And maybe the book wasn't like Cloud Atlas, but it definitely opened people's eyes to the possibilities of playing around with genre, of playing around with styles. I think that there's a whole thread in modern literary fiction and genre fiction that doesn't exist without this book.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a lot about that sort of, that metafictional thread. You opened up talking about the Whaley and like thinking about story, like as a concrete way, that I see a lot of work on, quote unquote, both sides of the literary genre divide, who are much more willing to play around with that now. And I don't want to lay it all at this one book's door, but it's certainly part of that movement. I'm not sure what else I want to say about metafiction with this. I wanted to figure out a way to get an Ishiguro ref in here, but we'll have to come back to that later.
I mean, Ishiguro, I have not actually read that much Ishiguro, but Mitchell acknowledges him as an influence. Mm-hmm. And, someone else who is more knowledgeable can say more about that. But everyone says, I think at the time that the book came out, everyone was like, oh, this is a student at the feet of Ishiguro.
And I want to say Never Let Me Go came out right after this, I want to say. Maybe even the same year?
Yeah.
One of those, like, if I had a nickel for every time a British literary star wrote a book about clones, I'd have 2 nickels, which is still strange. I thought I was going to take this in a bigger direction about the kinds of work that are blending genre like this, but I don't know. I think there's just so much to say just about this one concrete text that I am having a hard time connecting it.
I mean, I'll be honest, if I look around, I can't really put my finger on a single book that I can say, oh, this came from Cloud Atlas. I just think it sort of became diffuse in the atmosphere that everyone is now writing in its shadow. And one of the things, for example, you see a lot of in climate fiction is what Neil Harrison has called the overshoot novel, where you've got 3 plot strands, one in the past, one in the present, and one in the future. And, as I was saying before, you can see the connections, you can see the influences. For example, something like The Coral Bones by E.J. Swift, it's writing about the colonization of Australia. It's writing about scientific colonization. And it starts with a young woman who becomes fascinated with the coral reefs and starts studying them in the 19th century. And it ends in a future where the coral reefs have died. And obviously the connection from one to the other. So I think that this style, which is very prevalent in climate fiction, I think it owes a lot to Mitchell and to Cloud Atlas. This whole idea that historical fiction and science fiction are not distinct, and that especially as we talk about science fiction, we cannot ignore the role of history in bringing us here. I think that comes from him.
That's interesting. And maybe, and again, like I don't want to, without like doing intense research, I don't want to make this claim too strongly, but in quote unquote literary fiction, the technique of using multiple timelines has been around a long time, but extending it into the future maybe has become something that has become more common or more acceptable. Who was I'm totally blanking. What was the big climate fiction novel? It was on the Booker list. Shoot. It's got the algae in it. They go to space.
In Ascension by Martin McGuinness.
Yes. In Ascension feels like a book that very much has a lineage to Cloud Atlas. And I was thinking about that metafictional kind of approach and things like, I don't know, Noman Harkaway's book, which has like a very nested structure across timelines. I think it has some in maybe like classical antiquity. It has some in like a near future dystopia. Feels very much in line with this and is like this book playing a lot with those transition points and like how things are nested. How are the separate bits of the tale being communicated to the other bits of the tale as well as to you, the reader, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the book has been digested, and that can be a bad thing, but it's also a good thing because everyone now has it in their head that they can do this, and then they do really interesting things with it.
This was so much fun to come back to. It was a treat to come back and read this. He is doing so much fun on the page. Abigail, before we go, what else have you been working on? Where can people find you if they want to read your stuff?
Well, they can find me on my blog, Asking the Wrong Questions. They can find my contributions at Lawyers, Guns, and Money. They can find me on Blue Sky. A few weeks ago, I started a new project where I am reading my way through various works by J.R.R. Tolkien. I've started with The Lord of the Rings. I'm posting a new chapter every 2 weeks. And the goal here is, short critical essays on a topic that is evoked by each chapter that I'm reading. It's not like chapter by chapter. The most recent essay I posted was like 3 chapters together. There's going to be a chapter coming forward that gets 2 essays. So like the point is to talk about things that are interesting to talk about in this book. And I was actually thinking about that today, and I was thinking about the fact that, there's so many people doing this right now. Rosanna Pendlebury and Ed Moreland are reading through The Lord of the Rings. The Range Touch guys have dedicated a whole year to Tolkien. Nick Hubble and Jared Petracek have both announced that they're doing read-throughs. And I thought about it, and I think maybe this is about you.
Oh yeah,
because think about it. These are like mostly people who have guested on A Meal of Thorns. Mm-hmm. You're putting something out there.
Interesting. Oh, that is interesting.
So really, there's an influence here.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I will take credit for J.R.R. Tolkien's literary success. Estate. You can look me up. You can send me my percentage.
So that's going on my blog, and you can follow that if you're interested.
It is interesting that. It feels weird to say Tolkien is having a moment.
I know, right? But he really is.
A figure as omnipresent and discussed and academically studied and popularly, adapted. But there is like a moment happening. The Weird Studies podcast is doing a whole Tolkien chapter too, like focusing on some of like the lesser known stuff. Yeah, I don't know. Fortunately, there are no parallels between what's happening in The Lord of the Rings and the real world.
Hey, Tolkien is very, very insistent that we not read his work as allegory.
It's not allegory. It's really not. I think I am more than cordially disliking it. But Abigail, thank you so much, and I will catch you around.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a delight.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Baudrillard, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, congrats! You may be good. A few different ways you can do that. You can join our Patreon. Throw us a couple bucks a month to keep the podcast and the magazine sustainable. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a few other perks on the way. If you're interested in a book we mentioned on the podcast, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut. It helps immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, elaborate compliments? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky for however long that stays cool, and probably slightly past that. Next time, they did it. They finally made me read Ready Player One, but at least I get to talk about it with utopian and dystopian scholar Matthew Leggett. More cool stuff coming up after that. Check the website if you want to read ahead. And again, I implore you to check out the ARB fundraiser. Thanks for listening, as always, and stay critical out there.